and welcome to Softcover, ThePrint's online venue to launch non-fiction books. In today's episode, we're going to talk about a Penguin publication, and I have it for you right here. It's called Nehru and the Spirit of India. And I'm very excited to bring to you our conversation with the author of this book, Manash Firaq Bhattacharjee. Manash is a writer, a political theorist, and a poet. He has written for multiple publications, including a regular contribution to The Wire, as well as the New York Times, the LA Review of Books, and a whole host of international publications. Manash, welcome to the show.
Hi, Raghav. Thank you very, very much for hosting this conversation. And I'm also very thankful to The Print for giving this platform where we can talk to each other about the book.
Yeah, great. So as we just discussed before the start of the call, I think I wanted us to get started by you talking more generally about yourself, more about your background, and how that informed this book. Given that given that we know that this book is called as given that we know that this book offers an original perspective on Indian history.
Yeah, so I would actually limit it a little bit and say that this would probably be seen as, offering a unique and new sort of perspective on Indian intellectual history, particularly with Nehru, but probably a few things about history as well, about how to really look at history, particularly Indian history, right? Both through Nehru as well as largely in terms of the historical discourse. So in terms of how I really came, to Nehru and finally this whole journey which resulted in this book. So it pretty much started, I think, during school when there was this contrast which I made, right, between my teacher and my father. And that I sort of locate as the earliest point where perhaps, Nehru in a way enters my consciousness. But, to broaden this a bit, let me just say that, all of us growing up in any nation are introduced to our history, to our popular figures in various ways from various sources of reception. So, for instance, we have institutions like the school where we have textbooks and we have teachers telling us the story of Indian history. And then we have the institution of the family, whose significance is a lot. And also, I would say that the family, apart from being an institution, is not really like any other institution in the sense that it is also a patriarchal institution. So it has a lot of authority over our thinking. And there, of course, you have parents and your elders who are, constantly at the dinner table or sitting around telling you things about your history. Then we have social spaces like the neighborhood where you learn from neighbors, you learn from your friends. And also when you travel, you learn from strangers and people living in other regions of the country. So all of these also make up our introduction to our history. Plus you have these mediums like the newspaper, the magazines, and you also have the radio and the television. So there are these journalistic mediums, also the print capitalist mediums through which we also come to learn about our nation. And the interesting thing I would also like to add here is that it is not often that we receive these informations and news of the history of our nations on our popular figures only in a particularly objective and detached manner, because often these informations are also sort of told to us. We receive them in very emotional tones. So our feelings are also involved. So it is not just the mind through which we really learn about our nation. We also learn it through the heart. Whether it is disturbing events like partition or events of persecution and violence, but also instances of friendship and love. So all sorts of emotions are evoked in this whole learning process. So in my case, my teacher was probably imparting a certain school curriculum to us was much more detached and composed, whereas my father was more intimate and direct, and he would just tell us things at home without any sort of background or preface or introduction. The moment maybe he would hear something about Nehru or Gandhi, he would mostly flare up. And I could realize that he had a very, very bitter sort of feelings regarding these figures. But I could never understand, and probably I would feel that, okay, maybe one day I will come to know where he was coming from. But somehow he did not impress me beyond a point, because I used to keep wondering, but why was he doing that, and what was the necessity of doing that? I was also a little bit, rebellious in my childhood, not really taking authoritarian figures very seriously all the time. And then my elder brother comes into the picture and complicates the scene, because when we come to know that he actually wins the Nehru Symposium in Assam state, representing his school, which was Kendriya Vidyalaya in Guwahati. So when we learned that that he won this symposium, and then he was also representing Assam in Delhi for the National Symposium on Nehru. It was easy even for a school kid like me to realize that he wouldn't have spoken badly about Nehru, right? He would have said good things about him. And he also is something that I observed, did not consult my father about the speech he gave. So all of this informed me that, okay, there are different ways of being introduced and relating to your figures, and there is time for me to think and figure out from all these different sort of people, from their reactions, about how maybe I would like to finally look at Nehru. So I hadn't come to any conclusion. And talking about school times, the last important instance perhaps which comes in my education of his both Indian history and Nehru, would be perhaps the very important serial that came on Doordarshan every Sunday morning in 1988, if I'm right, Bharat Ek Khoj by Shyam Benegal. And that serial had a big impact also in my mind. The way Roshan said, with this very elegant demeanor, would come on screen, and standing in the ruins, he would slowly tell us about Indian history. That whole way of narrating the story of our history also had a very nice impact on me, and that is perhaps my lasting impression of what kind of a figure Nehru probably was. And also that was the first time that I was introduced to the discovery of India and the idea of India through that book.
And that was almost a decade before you had this seemingly very seminal or important conversation with Mr. Sudipta Kaviraj, who, as our readers will know very soon, also wrote a recommendation blurb at the cover of this book, referring to the book as is an excellent work that captures the spirit of Nehru's political thought with critical sympathy. So, in the introduction of your book, you mentioned your 1997 meeting with your 1997 meeting with them, and how that really influenced the focus of your MPhil study. Do Do you want to say a little bit more on that?
Yeah, sure. So the story, in a way, begins just a little earlier when we had this course which was taken by Professor Rajiv Bhargav, who was teaching then in the political science department in JNU, where I was a student. And this was during my MPhil, when he took this course on Indian nationalism. And apart from the usual figures, we had, Vivekananda's famous Chicago speech, and also Aurobindo, among the, figures we discussed in that course. And but started with Nehru's Discovery of India. And that was the first time I read the book. And I must say, I was quite taken in by the extremely layered, sophisticated, complex sort of narratives which were coming out from the book. It was still too early for me to really grasp what all was going on in the book, but it had a huge impact. And I still remember that on the day we actually discussed the book, when Professor Bhargav asked us, in the room, so what did you think about the discovery of India? And this fellow classmate of mine was the first person to sort of respond. And I still remember her saying, I did not know that Nehru was such a dreamer. And that's a statement I still remember, because, that was a very beautiful thing to start off the discussion with. And now, thinking about that statement, it appears to me that the way I was talking about sources of deception and all of that, the way she said that I did not know that Nehru was, right, was a dreamer. So her not knowing this probably also had to do with the informations about Nehru that she had probably collected from the different sources in her life, which sort of did not tell her or did not prepare her for the kind of experience that she went through while reading the book. So that's also an important indicator of how we receive our history and our figures. And then finally, when I decided to work on a Nehru for my MPhil, I was lucky to meet Sudipto Kaviraj, who was actually passing by Delhi for a couple of days, and he was staying at the International Guest House in JNU. And I went and met him. And we discussed Nehru. I shared with him some of my initial views, and he seemed agreeable to those views. And in a moment of, what I would call, some kind of, generosity, he actually shared with me some very important and interesting details of that essay on Nehru, which for some, reasons he had decided to abandon. And he shared even the title with me, which is The Man Who Discovered India, which I used as the introduction, the title of my introduction. And he shared some of these very interesting details with me. And when I saw that Kaviraj was interested in my ideas, that gave me a lot of confidence to think ahead and to work the way I did on Nehru for my MPhil.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And going off that personal touch, then we must say at the outset that this is to our viewers that this is a very very academic minded book with a lot of references to political theorists and philosophers of years past. And going off of that, let me tell you all that this book is broadly divided into four major chapters. One is on the theme of modernity. One is on the citizen and secular state business. Then we talk about culture, and then we talk about history and the roots towards the present. So let's get into some of these specifics. So in the first chapter, you talk about how Nehru sort of accepts the British or the West at large as these legitimate agents of modernity. How do you think his approach would be seen today, given that in our political climate, in our societal climate, we seem to be going back to certain traditional values, certain forms of revisionism, and so on?
Sure. Yes, that's an interesting question. Nehru actually saw the West in this paradoxical sense of being, like you said, and something that I've mentioned in the book, that they were the legitimate agents of modernity, but legitimate agents of modernity uh, in the wide sense of the whole, modernity as a movement of thought and social and cultural and political change. So there, Nehru was very excited by modernity, by modern ideas, by these huge transformations that were taking place in society in the West, and he sort of wanted to in a way incorporate those kind of changes in India, and wanted India to also change. But then, even though Nehru did look at the West and also the English as these legitimate agents of modernity, he also saw them as illegitimate agents of colonialism. So this distinction between colonialism and modernity, which all of us faced here in India, which was faced by all our anti-colonial figures when they were battling the British Raj. Everybody had to go through this very this very complex situation where you seem to be influenced by some of the very new, exciting, refreshing ideas of modernity and these social changes which were appearing due to it. But then you were also not being able to reconcile it anyways with the whole baggage of colonialism, which was actually also bringing in these changes. So that really made a very conflicted idea of the West in the eyes and minds of in nationalists, right? And so this paradox was sort of seen differently by different people. Nehru, for instance, welcomed modernity, but he would question the British. Whereas Gandhi, for instance, takes a diametrically opposite view, where he is, not as anti-British as he's anti-modern civilization, which means Gandhi, a figure completely opposite to somebody like not just Nehru, but also figures like Ambedkar, who also welcomed the principles of the French Revolution, liberty, fraternity, equality, and all of that. So there were these varying sort of stances that everybody took vis-a-vis the West. And if we think about how, like you said, how it will be seen today when people are trying to hold on to or go back to traditional values or question of tradition. Well, the first thing to be said here is that to sort of dispel the myth that there is something traditional about tradition. Like, tradition is not something pre-colonial, pre-modern. The very meaning of tradition, the very idea of tradition was actually defined, described, understood, fashioned, so to say, in modernity itself. Before modernity, there was no tradition. Whatever was there was simply there. The whole idea that there is a tradition that people follow was actually a modern invention to sort of distinguish between the past and the present, to distinguish what the modern was. So what was the modern against? The modern was against what was called tradition. So the problem with this juxtaposing between tradition and modernity, which was actually done first in the West, we sort of just simply imbibe that sort of language and these concepts from the West, is because modernity had to be separated from its past, and that past was supposed to be traditional. But then the way the traditional was defined, and also in India, is precisely where problems begin, because for many people, tradition was actually defined in the way, for instance, the European Orientalists conceived of India. The the religious texts, the sort of practices that the West took note of and they wrote seriously about, that actually became tradition for us as well. So we were also actually learning about our own traditions, ironically, through the eyes of the West. And we also try to define tradition in that manner. So in a way, what we call the tradition then and what we call tradition now, in many ways, they also involve choices about what is more important, what is less important, what is more ours, what is perhaps also ours and slightly different from what we hold to be ours. So tradition is so diverse, and it is it is so many things that it is almost impossible for us to define ourselves as one single tradition if we really go into this diversity, which was actually the case before modernity. But because modernity, modern knowledge, and all this interaction with the West sort of streamlined, defined what we mean by tradition so much, where we left out a lot of things from our own from our own tradition, as much as we took on certain things which is today defined as a tradition. So the problem actually lies in our very, very careful, deliberate selectivity, and the way we are actually selected certain modes of practice and thought and belief as traditions. So that way, tradition also is as much a modern problem as modernity also is.
No, that's a very insightful thought, especially especially the last line you said, because in my mind that essentially sums up a lot of today's discourse as revisionist in a sense. So going off of that, obviously the one most significant portions of the book is that second chapter on citizen and on the secular state business. And there's very obvious parallels that you found between some of Nehru's writing and Nehruvian ideas of citizenship with very contemporary issues or issues stemming from the last 30 years, such as the Citizenship Amendment Act. And to those of you in our audience who don't know this yet, Mr. Bhattacharjee grew up in Guwahati, grew up in Assam, so he witnessed some of these problems up close and personally. So let's talk about that a little bit. You say that Nehru's definition of the citizen was porous against a certain concept of otherization, and in turn, how do you think this was related to some of your own personal experiences growing up in Guwahati?
Right. Yes, I mean, one of the most telling and fascinating thing which I discovered about Nehru talking about citizenship during the Constituent Assembly debates is how he really throws open the question of the citizen. So whereas there were some members who were trying to articulate a very ethnic and religious understanding of who the refugee is and who the citizen should be, who is the ideal citizen and who is not. Against this trend, Nehru actually throws open the question of the citizen and the refugee, and he actually goes on to say that, look, anyone who wants to be the citizen of India can be the citizen of India. That's the widest sort of definition that one can offer to a refugee to becoming a citizen, and the most generous of course. And this also was striking for me, because this also means that the idea of the citizen, in a way, the way Nehru articulated it, told me that somewhere the definition and the understanding of the refugee and who can be the citizen is actually happening prior to the strictly legal institutional idea of who the refugee is and who the citizen is. So even prior to a certain status, legalistic, understanding, he's actually throwing open the question and saying that, look, we the people can decide. As somebody belonging to India can say something like this about who is the citizen and who is the refugee. So he brings in a certain kind of emotional content and intent into the idea of the refugee and the citizen, and that's really for me a big moment, because it means that we are not treating the newly born nation state to discriminate or to fix very strict rules about who to include and who to exclude. So these these legal sort of ideas of exclusion and inclusion is being preceded by this very large-hearted, open, generous sort of idea that Nehru is throwing open, and that is also a very interesting idea, precisely because for Nehru the question of belonging was very important. He believed that, look, in order to be the citizen, you have to belong. That feeling of belongingness should come. So anybody who was coming to India wanted to belong to India, so that feeling of belonging should be welcome. And that is how the idea of the new nation state should be built. And that, of course, is something which is also facing a certain crisis today. But in my time, of course, growing up as a schoolboy in Assam, when I for the first time heard that I was an outsider, that I was a foreigner in my own place of birth, that was very difficult for me to process. And I was obviously, in deep crisis to understand my surroundings, and very basic questions I was confronted with, like, do I belong to this place? Does this place belong to me? Do these things which I had always thought were part of my life, part of my environment, do these things belong to me any longer? So the question of belonging is the first thing, that comes into a crisis when your, where your status as a citizen is put under question. And then also, it also introduced to me this strange sense of groundlessness, that does the ground on which I stand on belong to me? And this radical feeling of groundlessness, is something that I think I have carried with me all through. And even today in Delhi, I feel quite groundless. And even though I know that legally I would, I may be the citizen of this country, but experientially the way I have faced the question of being other, as you put it, that really had a deep psychological impact. And even, ironically, when I used to visit our relatives in Calcutta during my growing up years, very educated, Bengali men belonging to my family, they would actually make fun of my East Bengali accent and dialect, because my Bengali is not the way Bengali is spoken in West Bengal, particularly in Kolkata, and so when they used to make fun of my language, that used to hurt me and also often make me angry. But then what it also did is impact, made a deep impact upon the psyche, that, look, I am an outsider even here. So in West Bengal, which is supposed to be the home for Bengalis and all of that I did not feel at home even there. So So one of the most important thing perhaps which we can connect vis-a-vis my experience growing up in Assam and Nehru's porous and open idea is precisely, I think, this question of belonging, that if you don't allow people to belong, you estrange them from their own worlds. And that is why today, when we talk about all the legal and other aspects of this whole ethnic and religious demarcations of determining who is a citizen and who is a refugee, we must somewhere take into account this question of belonging. And here I would end by saying this last important thing, that for me, that is why, having experienced all of this so far, I would actually, despite, having good feelings for the very inclusive, liberal, secular understanding of the citizen, that, that believes that there should be no exclusionary, whether ethnically or religiously speaking, of the refugee, and demarcate the refugee like that. And so the idea of citizenship should be very inclusive. Despite my liking for that idea, I would still like to put myself in a position where I would like to actually throw a reverse gaze at this question, because I would not like to understand the refugee from the perspective of the citizen. I would actually like to understand the citizen from the perspective of the refugee. I would, in fact, question the very idea of the citizen, which simultaneously gives birth to the idea of the refugee. Then what is this favored subject of the nation called the citizen, which is supposedly the most desirable idea for all of us? We all want to be citizens. We all, we would love to be called the citizens of a particular country. But what is this inbuilt sort of, this sort of split that it is creating between two different kind of human beings in this world? Is it a natural split, or is it a sort of, split that is created, invented, produced by the birth of nation states? So this artificiality of the, nature of the citizen, I would like to question as a refugee.
And would you then like refer to this sort of almost subverted or flipped approach or flipped perspective as this so-called minoritarian approach that that is mentioned at the outset of this book? Is that what you would refer to as a minoritarian approach, or are there some other aspects that would you like to bring in here?
You're absolutely, spot on, Raghav, to actually connect the minority question with this question. Mm-hmm. Yes, the refugee is also a minority as much as, there are other minorities in a nation state. And my approach and which I've called the minor or the minoritarian approach in this book, somewhere, if I may explain a little bit, comes, from this understanding of political ethics, which is, derived in a way from what the Jewish ethical thinkers, thought of in the previous century. And I'm talking about two people that I have mentioned in the book. One is the German, a Jewish thinker, Martin Buber, and the other is the French thinker, Emmanuel Levinas. And they, approach this question of the other in a very, very unique way, as different from the way the other is seen as a sort of negative figure in history, which is also an important figure for us to understand. So actually, there is a sort of a double narrative or a double discourse regarding this question, which I may quickly mention. So on the one side, you have this this knowledge that historically certain people have been other, and we know that the West, for instance, through colonialism and also otherwise, they have othered a lot of people in the world. People in Africa, people in Asia were othered by the West. In the case of the blacks, of course, you have slavery as one of the historical modes of othering. And what the West did to other people, blacks and Asians and others, they also did to their own people, where Jews, for instance, were also othered within, the white Western societies as well. So there was this multiple othering by the West of people, which is part of our historical understanding of the other as this negative figure in history, something which was addressed partly by Edward Said in his Orientalism. But then, in contrast to that, you have this ethical notion of the other, which these Buber and Levinas brings in from a certain kind of Judeo-Christian tradition of thinking, where the other is to be seen as a positive figure. The other is seen as desirable. The other is a figure that demands your love, your respect, your regard. And the other is someone that you need to sort of welcome into your own sphere of self. So that is the sort of positive notion and positive understanding of the other, which is precisely also the ethical sort of approach towards the other. So somewhere this this positive ethical notion of the other somewhere informs the question of the minor or the minoritarian question that I introduced here, where I am trying to raise this question that, look, there are, by numbers and by presence and also in relation to power, like people who are lower in the hierarchy and don't have the kind of social status or other kinds of status in society, they are to be regarded as the minorities of a nation. But it need not be only the religious or the religious or the social minority as such. Even within a majority community also you can have minorities of various kinds. For instance, I am Hindu by religion, and I grew up in Assam, and then I faced this whole question of the refugee, and so I also belong to a minority community of refugees, despite being part of a majority, right? So the idea of the minor and of the minority can be actually seen in the ways they are placed politically, socially, or otherwise vis-a-vis the sort of the more dominant discourses of power, right? And so that means that the minor or the minoritarian is not just people. They are people. They are significantly people and people belonging to the minority, but they can also be at certain times perspectives or views which question the dominant view of certain certain political or social or cultural understanding. So the minor or the minoritarian is both. They are people. They are certain people who form the minorities in a nation, but they are also these other things, forms in which we resist, forms in which we speak, the perspectives that we have, that can also be minoritarian, because I have mentioned somewhere in the book that sometimes the majoritarian understanding can also seep into minorities as well. So sometimes even a minority can be speaking in the language of the majoritarian sensibility. So we have to be very careful about what is really the minor or the minoritarian.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another really insightful thought. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so several of the questions that I wanted to get to, we perhaps might not be able to this time. But I'm going to give you all a sort of very brief look into some of the other really interesting arguments that Manash has brought us here. For example, he talks about his discovery of the narrative spread by the Hindu Mahasabha at the time that Nehru had a bias towards a Persian cultural background. He also mentions Nehru's understanding of culture as a whole as being Weberian in a certain sense, and he also talks about a gendered language of mystique that Nehru uses in his closing arguments in the discovery of India. So for our final question, what I wanted to know from you was what part about this book or writing this book are you most proud of?
Okay, that's probably the most difficult question that you asked me. And I don't know really. I think many aspects in the book are very important and dear to me, like particularly this thing you mentioned about culture and how Nehru had this unique way of looking at culture, which is different from, say, the Marxist understanding of looking at culture, which I call the Weberian, which is coming from Max Weber, where he talks about how it is not just a contradiction, of social forces which produces history, but culture itself. That there is something, that cultures in the world have, and they have an individuality about themselves, and that can produce, historical changes. That's a very interesting idea that I sort of, probe into in the book, and which also actually, tells us a lot about the culture of power. Because if people believe that, look, certain radical political changes happened all over the world in the 20th century, but all those changes cannot be merely understood in this merely economic and social sense, because we have seen the culture of power being such an important and intrinsic thing, through which we today understand, for instance, the erstwhile Soviet Union, what happened in China, and many other countries where older forms of cultures of power was actually taken over by very authoritarian regimes, in various parts of the world. So this is a very interesting idea that you mentioned, as much as you mentioned about the Persian roots of Nehru, where again it's a question of culture, and where these questions of where we are constantly trying to make boxes, make rooms about tradition, culture, history, all of that actually are more nuanced and complex and diverse sort of things, which we need to open up more and more, whereas unfortunately we are closing them down. And one of the ways in closing them down is actually to also do it by shouting other people down. So, one way I would like to actually relate to the first question that you asked me about my growing up years and my problem with my father, sort of, telling me about Nehru and other, figures in the very angry, loud tone of his. I see a lot of that behavior today in the media, when people are, trying to shout others down. So if you're very confident of your point of view, I don't think you need to really shout at the top of your voice. And that actually reminds me in a way, of this one sentence that I read in some Reader's Digest, at a friend's place when I was in school, and probably that's why I took my father's sort of sermons in a certain way, where it was written, exaggeration is a truth that has lost its temper. And I would perhaps silently tell myself that, okay, maybe my father has a point, but clearly he's exaggerating because he's lost his temper. Today, in fact, I would like to slightly alter that sentence I read in the Reader's Digest and say that exaggeration is today's a lie that has lost its temper, perhaps. And lastly, because you asked me, what I'm really proud of. Perhaps not proud of, but something I did, in this book, which is probably unique and which has been probably done for the first time, is the way I've actually, given so much importance to that absolutely forgotten speech in 1966 on Nehru by the Mexican poet critic, the late Octavio Paz. Octavio Paz was a Mexican ambassador to India twice, and it is great, I think, for India to have had an intellectual of his stature in this country, and who wrote so much on India. His last book, in fact, In the Light of India, is dedicated to his love for this country. And so that speech was lying in the in the archives, and by an absolute miracle, I unearthed that speech of his, which is such a which is just when you read it, you can finish it in like 10 minutes. He must have taken 10 minutes to make that speech, but such absolutely brilliant, insightful things that he says about Nehru, differentiating him with other political and intellectual figures of the 20th century, political leaders from other parts of the world, and the way he actually differentiated Nehru in a positive and beautiful manner. Contradictions are a problem, but it is very important that these contradictions exist, because it's only when there is space for contradictions in a society that a society itself can exist. That, I think, is one of the crux of the arguments I make, and thanks to Octavio Paz, and I'm happy about that.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful wonderful and important nugget of information you shared with a lot of us who had honestly very little to no idea that this speech had ever taken place in the first place. As I said, unfortunately, that was our final question today. And as I said earlier, this Penguin publication by Manash Firaq Bhattacharjee, Nehru and the Spirit of India, is out now. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Raghav.
Thank you.